and we kind of know about it. We kind of hear about it in the news, but the opportunity to take positive, proactive action based on a consultation, and the idea that in fact any business can voluntarily report and make a difference is what is going to move us towards the vision of Freedom for Humanity, which is to just to reduce this scourge to nothing if we can. So thank you for that, and thank you to your team. So it's my great pleasure to introduce the next panel. The topic's business and modern slavery statements. What's required and why? So what we're looking here is the sort of, what are the inspirational items that we can do to take action against human trafficking? And what can we do as we understand these business and modern slavery statements what can that do to improve our brand and the idea of ethics awareness and purchasing, that consumers do care. I mean, consumers don't want to be buying things that have been using, forced labor and so on. So a really interesting topic, again, just adding to this amazing foundation of practical ideas of how we can make a difference. So I'd like to introduce our panel, starting with our facilitator. Our facilitator is Anjali Bedi, who heads the Psychometrics and Analytics practice at the Edelman Predictive Intelligence Center, or EPIC, what a great acronym, for Asia Pacific. Anjali has expertise in big data and analytics, and she uses her capabilities to not only help Edelman better understand consumer psychology with the power of numbers, but also help solve pressing societal issues such as human trafficking. By partnering with local and international NGOs and scraping data from open source, Anjali has developed the expansion of a Centre for Intelligence-led prevention and campaign strategy to combat trafficking across Asia Pacific. So welcome to you, Anjali, and we look forward to your facilitation. Our first panelist is Stephen Morse. Stephen Morse is the founder and CEO of Unchained Solutions, a Sydney-based consultancy that equips Australian organisations to comply with the Modern Slavery Act that we just heard about from Todd, and that's what he does to assist in that area. Our next panellist is Phoebe Ewan, Program Director for the Mekong Club, a Hong Kong-based NGO. The Mekong Club develops tools and solutions with the private sector to develop and implement sustainable solutions on a global scale. And our other panelist is Dr. Sagar Atota, and he's a senior academic and the discipline coordinator of management, human resource management, sport and recreational management in the School of Law and Business at the University of Notre Dame in Australia. He has been employed at the Sydney campus since 2007. He studied in India, USA, and holds a PhD from the University of New South Wales in Australia. He has over 40 academic outputs and has published 3 research books. His most recent book is entitled Mind Over Matter and Artificial Intelligence: Building Employee Mental Fitness for Organizational Success. He's published his research findings in high-impact international journals. His research has been featured in several international media outlets, including live TV. So, Anjali, over to you to take us through modern and business slavery statements, what is required and why.
All right. Sounds great. And we only have 40 minutes, so I'm just going to jump straight into it, especially with this panel. And you all have incredible depth and breadth of expertise in distinct areas. So I'm personally very excited to hear from you the responses to the many questions I have for you. So just to start off, let's start with contextualizing patterns around modern slavery. What forms of modern slavery impact businesses? What are the industries that are most at risk? And fundamentally, why does this happen? So, Phoebe, I'd love to start with you, and then we'll take it through the group.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I would have to say that virtually every industry in the world is in some way touched by this issue. So at the Mekong Club, we work with around 60 multinational organizations, and these businesses span from financial service providers through to hospitality companies, through to retailers and manufacturers. So we really see a breadth of businesses in terms of those that are impacted by this issue, but also those that are interested in stepping up to address this issue. So yeah, it really is. It's a global phenomenon, and it's really industry agnostic.
Yeah, absolutely. Stephen, how about you?
Yeah, so similar to the Mekong Club, we do work with corporations, mainly those based in Australia, but some of them are multinational. So yeah, I would agree with Phoebe that there's not really an industry that's unaffected by modern slavery risks. Some industries obviously have a greater impact than others, particularly those that are more complex entities. I think of institutions, educational, health-related institutions that have to, in a sense, consider not only issues around construction, if they're building a new facility, but then if they've got supplies, medical supplies or educational supplies. But there's also staff-related issues that are around the servicing of those operations. So they can't just look at where they're sourcing their materials from and the conditions of people who are working in those areas. They also need to consider what's going on in terms of who's servicing through cleaning, security, maintenance, and all those things. So there's quite a multi-layered approach depending on the size of your organization, your international presence, and the kind of different industries that you're intersecting with.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sagar, what would your response to this be in terms of the context around trafficking and sort of the nature of the crime and industries affected? Are there any distinct patterns you've observed?
Certainly, this is a global issue, and this kind of exploitation is happening all around the world. As I growing up in India, and I have seen things were happening there, and even coming to Australia and traveling to different parts of the world. Certainly, it's a major issue. A lot of businesses are facing, and one good thing, and what I observe in Australia is we have good policies and procedures, even though we are in the beginning. But I think we do have some kind of a good stage set in Australia. But amidst of all these things, the challenge is very real. The exploitation is very real, and a lot of employees are certainly, the receiving end of this modern slavery, and this is very timely. And I'm looking forward to discuss more on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. And given COVID and the incredible changes we've seen over the last 2 years, how have you seen modern slavery affected when it comes to the industries that have been, let's say, seen an increase in trafficking cases, and even down to the types of industries or the companies that, let's say, have, as they've tried to be more compliant with the Modern Slavery Act, whether COVID's made it more difficult to actually be compliant. So Phoebe, let's start with you on that one. I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, well, so one of the main indicators of forced labor as defined by the ILO is abuse of vulnerability, right? So traffickers prey on vulnerability. They're looking for people that are desperate for work. They're looking for people that don't have access to economic opportunities. They're looking for people that are more likely to maybe accept an offer that's literally too good to be true. And with COVID-19, we've certainly seen whole economies kind of shattered. We've seen people who are living day to day anyway losing their employment. We've seen mass migration of people across countries, kind of out of cities. And we've seen some industries really changed forever in some cases. So this increased vulnerability, we can only assume, is going to offer those traffickers more opportunity to target, which is unfortunate. And then we've also seen in some industries almost the opposite happening in terms of demand. So we've seen industries such as PPE, for example, where suddenly there's huge demand coming in from governments, from businesses, pushing prices down. essentially overwhelming suppliers and forcing them into potentially bad practices, like forcing workers into overtime or subcontracting their contracts in order to fulfill these demands, again, putting pressure on the workforce. So the global workforce and the global migrant workforce is really being put under pressure in a lot of different ways as a result of COVID-19. I think it still remains to be seen in terms of the long-term impacts, but certainly, at least here in Asia Pacific, we have seen an increase in vulnerability in many different ways as a result of COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. Stephen, what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, we've spoken to organisations here who have actually deliberately and for good reason for themselves shut down offshore operations. So where, for example, they might have system support in places like Philippines, India, call centres and the like, they've actually deliberately made decisions to shut down those offshore operations and localize them in Australia, which in one sense can shorten the supply chain and give them greater visibility of what's going on. But really it's about actually, due to issues of the pandemic. And as Phoebe's pointed out, then that increases the vulnerability which traffickers are all poised and ready for. And certainly in the early days back in 2020, not so much now because the focus has shifted, particularly in the Australian media, but seeing people transverse the vast subcontinent of India to make their way home with children and luggage, and doing it all on foot. So one of the issues that we've seen here, whilst in Australia, while we've had a safety net, we've had Job Keeper, all sorts of government supports, mainly for those who are citizens and permanent residents. These kind of provisions are not available in many other jurisdictions, and so people who lose their job, for all intents and purposes, are then left in a position where they need to borrow money, and then that then can lead to debt bondage, which then leads to other forms of exploitation and doing the kinds of work that they would not deem to be suitable in a pre-COVID condition. So, we've seen those issues around shutting down of offshore, and we've also obviously seen the disruption in logistics and the transportation of goods and services, which has touch points around ports and shipping. And so all those disruptions then put pressure, financial pressure, economic pressure on different communities. And so whilst we might think, there's panic buying in Australia, and there's been some very, we saw very silly kind of incidences in supermarkets in Australia where people are fighting over toilet paper. There's bigger problems going on in other parts of the world that we need to give due attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly not just Australia. I think every corner of the planet saw the toilet paper phenomena. Which I suppose that's another question about human behavior for us to address another time. Sagar, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well on how you perceive COVID to have impacted trafficking and the ability to remain compliant with the Modern Slavery Act.
Yeah, certainly. We all caught off guard with COVID-19. There were no policies and procedures, and there's nothing was there to follow through. And as the COVID-19 was unfolding, we were thinking about creating procedures and policies. And unfortunately, some people, some organizations took advantage of that vulnerable people who are at the receiving end of it could be financial problem or losing a job. It certainly, touched the people's core vulnerabilities, and medium organizations, big organizations, including small organizations. And as we have witnessed and how, including this, toilet papers, some people bought all the toilet papers and put it in their rooms and in the houses. These are the one example. In the globally also, in different countries, particularly in developing countries, we have seen that how people struggled. On one side, people were losing lives, and another side, some people were taking advantage of that. And so basically, there is some kind of a human element was it was definitely, there was a lot of questions raised through greed and selfishness and humanity and empathy and all these things. And So I think in a way that we are okay now, but still more policies and procedures are to be tested and taken place in order to prepare well and the continuous challenge that we are facing in.
Yeah, absolutely. So to get a little bit more specific into processes and policies, and Stephen, this question is for you. How have you seen organizations respond to the topic of modern slavery since the act was passed? And do you perceive that modern slavery legislation is going to be the new global norm?
Sure. Well, in answer to the first question, there's been a spectrum of responses to this legislation. Obviously, the greater visibility, the greater presence you have in the community, the more that you've done. So we've seen a great response in the financial services, the banking sector, probably on the back of a Royal Commission and needing to actually make sure that they do everything correctly. We've also seen some great movements from the big supermarket chains, the mining companies, all those who would feature prominently in the media. Are leading the charge, and that's evidenced in the Monash report that came out last year. Having said that, though, there is a spectrum of responses, and we are still engaging with companies. Some of who have emerged into the $100 million annual consolidated revenue mark and have entered into this space, going, "Oh, we are now compliant. We have no idea what we're talking about." That's great. Come and talk to us. That's good news for us. But still, I'm still encountering companies who really have not done much at all, who perhaps may have put a position statement together, who are thinking through, well, what is the value in the processes that are available? And I think that there's some good questions there around process and the kind of steps that companies need to take, because one of the, I think, weaknesses of the legislation has been a kind of choose your own adventure approach. Take reasonable steps, and that can be interpreted anyway. So on the one hand, I want to say there's been some really positive engagement from the top end of town, and we're now into the third year reporting. So there's been some really great progress that's been made, but there is also in the spectrum of companies, there's also a range of responses and some real question marks around, well, how much investment do I need to make? And probably the realization that this is going to take an investment in time, in budget, in personnel, in resources, in partnerships. That one of the weaknesses there is not actually coming to terms. It's really coming to terms with the magnitude and the gravity of the situation, and actually having a long-term goal and setting up some really clear objectives, which I think in talking to a lot of companies takes some time to actually formulate. So a lot of companies get going. They say, yes, I need a risk assessment. That's where we begin. And some person in the organization who doesn't usually deal with anything to do with risk is all of a sudden landed with this issue. I need to implement the Modern Slavery Act. And then it's kind of that kind of working out the jostling of like, what do we do? How do we do this? And how does this fit in with all the other things that we're trying to do and all the other compliance mechanisms that are upon us to do with reconciliation or the environment or diversity and inclusion or gender equality? All this is in the mix. And really there can be a lot of tensions within companies in trying to decide how to prioritize. Where do we put resources? What is the cadence? What is the necessary steps? What are the reasonable steps that we need to take to address this? So I think, there's lots of great activity happening, but we need, I think, more clarity in terms of, where companies really should be, particularly given the size and their capacity to do more in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. And a follow-up question for you. What do you think businesses can do to be more compliant?
From my perspective, I think a lot of companies need to actually go beyond compliance or go beyond process. So I think that there's a lot of data out there and a lot of received data that is in many ways very general in nature and perhaps a slightly historic. And I think that's one of the tensions with the processes that are being placed, whether that's categorizing suppliers and overlaying them with modern slavery risks, looking at an SAQ, so self-assessment questionnaire process, trying to follow that through with an auditing process. That would be probably the key thing to do. But I think one of the tensions is companies hiding behind data and not seeing that this process is both science and art. that there needs to be a lot done around strategy, around thinking through much more laterally, collaboratively. Who can we partner with? Who can work with us? Rather than just relying on received data and thinking, yeah, well, I've done my risk assessment. I know vaguely where the risks are to tier 6 or whatever. That is not enough. Companies need to, that's a great foundation to have a map and to have a heat map and to identify for segmentation where are the high, medium, low risks. But then okay, we now need to go deeper and we need to come up with some very clear strategies to engage suppliers responsibly, collaboratively, to incentivize them to do their own due diligence and resource them. And perhaps where we think, well, I don't have a very deep supply chain because I'm in financial services. Okay, well, where can I show leadership in this space? By partnering with universities to increase the research, particularly in Australia, where there's so much anecdotal evidence here in Australia, to actually what can we do to actually fund research, resource NGOs, partner, and actually move the implementation forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll come back to the partnership question shortly, but I want to carry on with some of the very poignant comments you were making about analytics and strategy. And Phoebe, I'd love to hear from you. What do you perceive the role of analytics to be in buffering companies against modern slavery and identifying risks and in being more compliant, given that one can't stop what they can't see?
Yeah, I think as Stephen put very well, it's definitely a science and art combination again. So if we think about typical companies that are under the Australia or UK Modern Slavery Acts, these companies have ginormous supply chains. Think about, your typical supermarket, they're selling everything from coffee to clothing to TVs to everything else. They may have thousands of kind of what we call tier 1 suppliers, so your immediate suppliers, and then thousands and thousands more kind of suppliers, and so on and so forth. So building a real accurate picture of your supply chain, it can be a very, very complicated task for a lot of organizations out there. And there are data sets available. Again, they can be historic or maybe, a lot of modern slavery is a hidden issue. There's a reason why it's so difficult to detect this issue, because we don't have reliable, accurate data. If we did, it would be a lot easier to stop. But there are data sets out there, such as the Global Slavery Index, the Trafficking in Persons reports. Department of Labor in the US has a list of goods and services that they consider to be tainted by forced or child labor. So there are some analytics that can be done with this data. We can get a kind of broad brush overview of where there might be higher risk country, commodity pairings, say, within that supply chain. So organizations may use this to create risk buckets, let's say, and maybe kind of give themselves a broad idea of where their risk may lie, which they then in turn use to create more targeted approaches when it comes to, say, their social auditing. So categorizing certain suppliers or certain business lines as higher risk, and then maybe conducting extra due diligence, maybe conducting physical visits to those locations in lieu of those self-assessment type processes. So there's various different ways in which this data is used. And we've definitely found an impact of COVID has been a real limitation in terms of where auditors can travel, for example. So there remains to be certain countries. I'm in Hong Kong. We're still facing travel restrictions here. So there's certain countries where we still can't be traveling into, we still can't be going to kind of physically check the factory, physically interact with the workers and get that kind of look and feel when it comes to the true working conditions within that supply location. So we found this kind of data analytics approach has provided something during COVID, but to Stephen's point, there are obviously limitations here when it comes to really drilling down and understanding on a supplier level what the true risk areas are. One interesting area of activity, and this is something that is being pushed through emerging legislation such as the German Supply Chains Due Diligence Act, is mandating grievance mechanisms. So mandating that workers within the supply chain have access to some kind of means to report issues or problems with their labor conditions. And ultimately, the German Act is looking to mandate this throughout the entire supply chain. So ultimately, you as a supermarket should have this grievance mechanism available in your own factories as well as in your suppliers' factories. You as a brand should be collecting all of that data in, and you should be able to report. So you should be reporting on the types of grievances that are coming in, how you as an organization is responding to those grievances, and how you are ultimately addressing the underlying issues that are being uncovered through this data. So grievance data coming out of grievance and these kind of grievance reporting mechanisms, it's a really, really interesting form of data because it allows you to validate your social audits. It allows you to validate your policy implementations and all of the paperwork that you may have in place to say that you've got this covered with real data from workers, which I think is certainly, a lot of organizations are doing this already, but I think it's going to be certainly an emerging trend when it comes to the application of data and analytics in this space. But ultimately, I think we all need to appreciate that data still has its limitations. Modern slavery is a hidden crime for a reason. And without really kind of understanding the supplier on an individual level and the supply chain on an individual level, there's always going to be a limitation there when it comes to relying on those analytics.
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps it's then a question of, given those limitations, asking the right questions, which I think frequently is challenging with a crime like this, but also having that broader range of sources, given that so many people who experience modern slavery are hesitant to report the circumstances that they're in. So I'm curious from your perspective, given the German Act, and it's a phenomenal idea, but are there any concerns that you have that workers might not actually report their grievances or might not report them accurately?
Yeah, definitely. I think when we look at existing grievance mechanisms out there, there's a lot of reliance on like having a hotline available, say, which is maybe posted on a company website. And some companies might report in their modern slavery statement, oh, we have this grievance mechanism, it's a hotline, but it's great. No one has felt the need to call it, so that means we don't have an issue. Now, actually, the opposite is usually true. If workers aren't using your grievance mechanism, then it probably isn't effective. So we're still definitely, this is a point of conversation that comes up a lot within our working groups. How do we actually create a grievance mechanism that interacts with the worker, builds trust with the worker, isn't just a faceless hotline on a website somewhere that you have to find yourself somehow and then trust enough to call? How do you actually use channels that the worker trusts, like say their unions or local NGOs or, other faces in the community that the worker actually trusts and understands, to implement that mechanism and make it more personal to that worker? When we see these types of initiatives take place, then we certainly see an uptick in that usage. And that uptick is a good thing because it means that the grievance mechanism is working.
Excellent. And we will likely come back to this point, and would love to hear some of the work that you're doing. But moving over to employees and employee engagement with a little bit more specificity. Given the context that we're in, and so much has changed for workers in the last few years, whether your workers are in conditions of modern slavery or workers in companies that are not in conditions of modern slavery, and that we have the context of the Great Resignation as well, where employees are much more focused on how they're being treated by the companies they work for, but also how purpose-oriented those companies are. And that's becoming increasingly impactful. Sagar, I'd love to hear, what has your research shown about the impact of companies treating their people with dignity and the impact of being purpose-oriented?
Yeah, certainly, Anjali. I think the most important thing is that no matter which background we come from, where we are, and every human being ought to be treated with the dignity, respect, and empathy. And that's the core of human essence, that every human being have that intrinsic worth. That treating everyone with complete decency and respect is extremely important. So our colleagues said really well and looking at all the extrinsic aspects, but I really would like to focus on intrinsic aspects here. Why some people, mistreat their employees, or else why some employees bear with that. It's interesting. I did a research a while ago, a few years ago, and I collected data from university students and also collected data from people in their 50s. And I found it fascinating that college students have more moral compass compared to the people who are in their 50s. What happens, when they're in the college times, they're very, perhaps more want to do the right thing, stand for justice, but as they grow old and settle down in their jobs and in the 50s, and they act in a way that not necessarily the right thing, but what is good for the company, or else what is good for them. So something is happening as we grow old. Perhaps it could be the business, the profit may be the important, or the financial commitments, or all these things. So it's people are not being authentic. So I'm not saying everyone is acting like that, but generally that is that tendency. So amidst of all these things, I think these policies and the procedures and all these things are very important. But at the same time, that a human transformation, which is the psychological transformation, is extremely important. And this kind of knowledge is important, but the most important thing is the kind of training that we give, constant training and putting into practice, and having a little bit of fear. I mean to say in a positive way. If you break the rules, you'll be punished. And having that kind of little bit of rule based, but at the same time human transformation based, that can facilitate for people to do the right thing. And employees are happy when they're treated with dignity and respect and empathy. And as I said, no matter, we all want to be treated with respect. That's for sure. Whatever the work, whatever the job that we are doing, that's our human right. And that to be treated with decency and respect. And so this kind of a moral foundation is very, very important. And it's a much bigger problem than we see, particularly in this kind of the society that we are living in, and people bombarding with the different ideologies and other stuff, that the right moral foundation with the right moral framework, and focusing on the psychological aspect, intrinsic aspect, to bring the transformation, so that we can deal with the issue in a broader sense, intrinsically and as well as extrinsically. I think we are at the moment, as we look at the literature, what's happening around the world, we are doing well bringing all these perhaps strategies and the policies and procedures. But the biggest missing link is that a psychological transformation, that a human transformation, that we all are equal and created in the intrinsic worth and with equal opportunities. I think that is where is the challenge for us, and more research ought to be done, and to bring that kind of into not only in Australia but globally, this kind of a transformation, how that can happen, how that can actually influence bigger organizations, and not only in the human aspect but also in a productivity too. I mean, there's a strong connection between human dignity and human treatment, and organizational productivity, eventually profit. So by treating human beings with fairly and with the justice and with the respect, actually that will increase our profits, organizational profits. I think that's where is our challenge. I think more work ought to be done in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so much transformation that needs to occur on all fronts to really tackle this issue effectively, given that we're talking about a crime that we all thought was eliminated back in the 1600s, and yet here we are in 2022 still discussing it. So on that note, when we talk about facilitating change, what do you perceive the role of public, private, and academic partnerships to be in combating modern slavery? And how can businesses leverage that to remove human trafficking from their supply chains? And I'd love to hear this answer from all of you. So, Stephen, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, I think addressing the issue of modern slavery or combating it is a collaborative approach. So it does take partnership, both at the government, private and the not-for-profit sectors and academic institutions. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done. I mean, Unchained, we partner with Macquarie University here in Sydney, and we're currently working with them to assess the corporate approach to the issue of modern slavery. And so that collaboration is vital. It strengthens their understanding and buffers their research, because we're actually they're getting actually the real information from companies through us. And we're also then benefiting from that as well. So just coming back to my earlier point, I think, there's a lot that can be done to demonstrate leadership in space through CSR programs perhaps, or working, with different entities who can actually get the data. I think, for example, there's a lot to be done. NGOs to partner with academics to actually do more of that kind of contextual research into different areas and where the risks are and what is the nature of those risks, and to really assess the work of NGOs and what does impact look like, what does change look like on the floor in a factory or on a farm or in the fishing industry. So I think there's definitely scope for academia, and then conversely for NGOs and NFPs who are working in that space, working directly with survivors, working with those both in a rehabilitation or restorative process, and those that are working, we partner with freedom businesses, so businesses that have been set up, social enterprises who have been set up to actually provide vocational training and real employment for people who have come out of a traumatic experience or who are at risk of being exploited, to help them to find employment that in a sense empowers them and helps them to restore dignity. So I think there's a lot of actors in the space to both inform and to receive assistance. So both in the private and the academic and the NGO at the NGO level. And of course, I think there's still a lot of work that can be done at a government level to really to engage with the sector and to resource different sectors to, in a sense, be part of the dialogue in setting the agenda, to keep this on the agenda. It's amazing how sustainability issues in general, particularly this one, can just slip from public view and from the attention. And so all of a sudden, when there's an economic downturn or there's an election on or whatever it is, these kind of issues can just sort of simmer away and sort of be almost forgotten. So I think I would like to see that more from government and more opportunities open up for resourcing and partnership and leadership.
Right. And Sagar, what are your thoughts on this?
I agree with Stephen. The most important thing is I think we need to take a multi-national research approach to bring evidence-based and data-based solutions to the problems that we are seeing already. And some research has been done, and a lot of universities are taking this very seriously. And I'm very pleased to say that, my university, the University of Notre Dame, in the forefront now. We are creating a whole new branch, and recently we hired an associate professor to tackle this, and it's became one of the key point for my university to tackle this. And similarly, like a lot of academics has to come forward and in order to influence the opinions, not only in Australia, but around the world. So what I would suggest is most multinational approach, data-driven and evidence-based approach is required to tackle this problem effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. And Phoebe, what are your thoughts on the role of public-private partnerships?
So we're an NGO ourselves at the Mekong Club, and we focus squarely on private sector engagement when it comes to addressing modern slavery. And I would say one of the most useful activities that we engage in, I think, for ourselves and also for our members is facilitating these confidential, closed-door, Chatham House rules type working groups, where we bring together companies from financial services, retail, manufacturing, all of our different sectors together. And we sit down and we have some really frank, honest conversations about what everyone's doing or the challenges that everyone is facing and what is actually really happening in this industry. And it's always really interesting to see companies interact with each other and to see them face the same challenges. Oftentimes they just want to hear that someone else in the room is struggling with grievance or struggling to understand how to conduct remediation or any other kind of area of activity. So that in itself is incredibly useful. It's also useful for us on the NGO side because it allows us to really see under the hood, so to speak, of the private sector outside of the CSR reporting and the modern slavery statements, kind of what is really happening. And then we look to then make connections with other NGOs. So there's some amazing organizations doing such great work on the ground in a lot of the countries that our private sector partners are operating in. They have access to great intelligence data, great staff. They can help with training, remediation, everything else, but they don't know necessarily how to connect with these private sector partners. So amazing things can be done when we bring these two communities together and they start to trust each other and talk to each other and realize that they can solve each other's problems if they collaborate together, which is very, very exciting. And then I'd say on the government point, I think a big part of the reason why conversations like exactly this one we're having today are happening is because of legislation. Unfortunately, a lot of companies will be pushed to act because of government action. We're seeing amazing legislation, as I mentioned before, coming out of Europe. We have existing legislation in the UK and Australia. And certainly we see a lot of our partners here in Asia Pacific acting as a result of these requirements coming from governments. So governments have a huge part to play in shaping how the drive for modern slavery will evolve over the next few years.
Fascinating. And thank you for sharing that. So sadly, we're starting to get close to the point where we're going to need to wrap up, although I would love to keep this conversation going for another 2 hours. So my last question for all of you, is there any hope? Modern slavery is such a large and seemingly endemic problem. So is it actually possible to remove modern slavery from company supply chains entirely? What's the process for that? And why should companies even try? Sagar, I'd love to start with you on that one.
Yeah, it's a long process, certainly. And as I said, in addition to all these policies and policies and strategy, we need to take more humane approach and transforming the individual. But one of the key thing is continuous training. Where actually that transforms the human person. Until that kind of a human approach is not there, this extrinsic aspects may not work. So I think we need to deal with the human spirit in order to bring the extrinsic move forward and in order to bring a lasting change. Yeah,
absolutely. Phoebe, what are your thoughts on that?
I think as long as there are opportunistic people in the world, there's always going to be some level of exploitation within the labour workforce. I don't think we should be striving to remove this issue entirely, because I do think that might be impossible. However, it's 2022. We're still talking about this issue, and there's so many easy wins out there in terms of things that companies can do tomorrow to better address this issue. So there's grievance mechanisms that can be engaged with. There's new partnerships that can be made. Companies can take a really honest look at what they're currently doing and where they can be better. And there's so many great resources and organizations like everybody on the call here today out there that are excited and willing to help. So I'd really encourage everybody to not look at this problem as a big, overwhelming issue that simply can never be solved, but think about what are the steps that I can take tomorrow, that I can take in 12 months' time to play my part or ensure my organization plays our part in addressing the issue today.
Great, thank you. And lastly, Stephen.
Sure. There's always hope. There is definitely always hope. And I think one of the things we like to do with our clients is to not just think about this issue as a problem space, but actually to think this as an opportunity space. So in addressing the issue of modern slavery, where are the opportunities? Where can you leverage influence? Where can you actually strengthen the connectors within a supply chain, which will ultimately bring greater prosperity through the supply chain because it's more resilient? So really, it's not just about solving a problem, but it's also about understanding your ecosystem, the ecosystem in which you work in, and where you can actually influence and make changes, and to see where the opportunities are, and to in a sense develop the business case for this. Because if it's just driven by law, then it will seem like a compliance piece. But if we actually see all the actors involved in the production and the delivery of products and services as partners in this matrix of this modern economy, and obviously there's a lot of transformational work that needs to be done in terms of business practice. But I think it's about seeing the opportunities that are out there, and seeing the opportunities that come through restoring dignity. To have people in different parts of the world who have choices to operate freely and with economic power as well. Surely that would actually have a long-term benefit for those who perhaps, for all intents and purposes, hold all the power. So I think in power sharing, in resourcing and in making more resilient supplies of goods and services, I think that's going to be an absolute benefit for all. Whether or not we eradicate slavery, I think there's always going to be people who are going to see an opportunity to exploit someone. So that's not our goal. It's actually about what can I do today or tomorrow to make a real difference.
Right. Well, thank you for that. And thank you to all three of you for such an insightful conversation. I certainly learned a lot listening to all of you, and to the audience, I hope you did as well. So with that, I will turn it back over to the MC. And again, Phoebe, Sagar, Stephen, thank you so much for your conversation today.
Thank you, and Julie.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anjali. That's fantastic. That's just another fantastic panel there with some great, great insights on how we can practically take action and actually, make a difference by being proactive. We've got a little bit of time up our sleeves, so I was wondering if the panel, if you can all stay on just for just a minute or two more. My first question is for Dr. Sagar. How can people overcome the fear of change? Can you kind of give us a sort of quick oversight of that? Just sort of how do people overcome the fear of change?
I think the first thing is we need to look into understand what could go wrong, and what the worst could happen. If we can deeply explore that, that might remove some of the myths of the fear. And so the more clarity that we have about the issue, and that might help to overcome fear. But at the same time, having this kind of not only the problem, but there is some kind of hope. There is a way out in dealing with some of these challenges. So the getting into the root of the problem, but at the same time showing some kind of a way out could help us to overcome the fear of change.
Yeah, look, I think that makes a lot of sense, and also understanding that perhaps it may not be as bad as we think it might be, and just helping people understand that. So yeah, I think that's really, really effective. Thanks for that. And then Anjali, I guess if you could just perhaps help us facilitate through the panel. Where do you see business and modern slavery statements in 5 years' time? That's an interesting question that's just come in. Where do you see it in 5 years' time? Where do you guys see the evolution of this, what we're doing today, but where do we see it in 5 years from now? Over to you, Anjali.
Absolutely. And that's a fantastic question. Stephen, I'd love to start with you on that one. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, can I just revisit the previous question just for a second? Sure. I think the fear of change really comes through being familiar, interfacing. I think if people actually go and contextualize themselves in this in the space and actually see that that this is the world in which we live in, and actually to face the reality of and have a real serious engagement, and that these are people. These aren't numbers. These aren't sets of data. That these are people who are operating and living in the world. And I think the more we socialize ourselves, and the more we become familiar with real people and real jobs and real lives, I think the fear of change will dissipate because there'll be no option but to rethink and reform how we actually operate in the world. Coming back to the actual question, I think, where do we see statements in 5 years' time? I think, that's hard to project. It's really got to do with the goals. But my hope, I think I'll just put this in a more kind of predictive, more predictive, but more aspirational sense of what I'd like to see statements. But I think definitely to see a lot more detail around more specifics around how companies are assessing risk and addressing that risk and their ongoing monitoring and reporting, to actually have put in place really good indicators and metrics around measuring effectiveness, and having collected a lot of data through grievance mechanisms that actually that people who are working in different parts are responding to, that they can actually have really clear, more specific data in terms of not just what the risks are, but actually what they're doing and the impact of the actions that they've taken, because that's part of the criteria, is to measure the impact of actions taken. So I'd like to, definitely, that would be good to see that. I think we should have that in 5 years' time. But I think also on the partnership front, to have really clear functioning strategies around shared value partnerships, working across the different sectors, intergovernmental and intersectorial engagement, and to some really cool, probably shouldn't use the word cool, but some really cool partnerships developing with NGOs in particular. So to have a transformation in CSR, really, that we're not just going to put our brand on some building or a T-shirt, but actually we're working with this community in Cambodia, and we're doing some really good work to resource them and learn from them, and to really help build these local communities and the context within which exploitation occurs. And I think that's what we need to address the context of which it occurs, and to give, you really restore dignity to various communities. I think that's my hope, to get more specific and to have some really great partnerships occurring.
I appreciate the use of the word cool. I think if more people thought transformation and combating human trafficking was cool, we might be in a different space. Phoebe, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. Where do you think modern slavery legislation, both in Asia but also globally, will be in the next 5 years?
Yeah, I think there's, as Stephen kind of mentioned, there's definitely likely to be more of a focus on impact-related data. So I personally find it most interesting within a modern slavery statement, very cool, when a company discloses cases that they've found, and they go into details in terms of how they've actually remediated those cases, what they've learned from the process, and the kind of measures they've put in place to learn from that experience. Now, 5 years ago, if a company were to kind of publicly disclose that they had modern slavery, it might be all over the news. It might be a real kind of negative event. But I think it's really, really important that we as a society, as kind of ESG raters, as NGOs, as commentators on this issue, look to reward those companies that are publicly disclosing this information and actually see that as a really positive thing. So I'd really like that expectation and that standard to continue and to continue to grow. To see more data around that impact and more data around the process of remediation, that would be really great. I also think more broadly, legislation is likely to move more into the realm of being a bit more prescriptive in terms of what companies actually need to be reporting on. there's some organizations that their modern slavery statements are wonderful and very detailed, others less so. And I think maybe more kind of prescriptive guidance, at least in terms of the categories that companies need to be including, will likely happen within kind of the next revisions of the UK and Australian Modern Slavery Acts, along with acts like the German Act, which are being very prescriptive in terms of kind of mandating certain elements such as grievance are included therein.
What an exceptional international panel we've had on this really important topic and practical topic of being able to make these things happen. So, thank you to